current circumstance?
Without question, it does. Look, biblical teachings, and certainly the Ten Commandments, are instructive. They're anything but arcane or esoteric or outdated. In addition to, regardless of one's religious worldview, many of us as religious people also regard them as eternal truths that are important to our eternal progression and salvation. But even if you didn't, if you look at those 10 commandments, including those that you just described, they also outline a formula for happiness. Because they prescribe the manner in which you interact with your fellow human beings. There's no more evil that can come from humans than when they view themselves as virtuous and their actions in a particular cause as so unmitigatedly right that everyone else must be wrong. And when they're confronting a fellow being or multiple fellow beings or a huge nation of them as undeserving of virtue, there's no more evil that can come in this world than when that paradigm comes into play, when that contrast comes into play. And so that's one of the reasons why I had not heard before that particular analysis of taking the Lord's name in vain. When you add that to other commandments, biblical commandments, including covetousness, for example, admonitions against theft, against adultery, against killing, those all kind of have a consistent theme in them. And so, yeah, I think that can come into play in circumstances like these. In fact, I think that's what drives most wars. People start to think of themselves as virtuous, assign immense unmitigated virtue to their own cause, and assign evil to their adversary. And that's how people get involved in massive conflicts.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's the two dimensions of unearned moral virtue. The first is we're all good without any effort. And so that's pretty damn convenient because it actually turns out to be an extraordinarily difficult endeavor to actually be good because the devil's in the details and you have to set your house in order from the levels of the personal all the way up through the levels of the social to actually be good. And that requires a lifetime of commitment, but also falling into that narrative also gives you a very convenient place to put Satan himself. So instead of having to scrub your own conscience and determine where you might be, let's say, falling short of the glory of God, you can say, well, no, all the evil is aggregated conveniently in the body of our enemy, and this would be Putin in this particular case. You can heap nothing but derisive hellfire and scorn upon him, and then you're scot-free on that front too. And so all of that's a little too convenient. I do think this interpretation, by the way, of taking the Lord's name in vain, I think it is in keeping with the original intent of the formulators of the commandments, because I've looked at a lot of different translations, and we beat this idea to death in this seminar. And this notion that, well, and it makes sense conceptually too, right? I mean, you can't imagine that there could be a greater evil than doing the easy thing for you and then claiming that that's actually ordained by omniscience, omnipresence, and omnipotence itself.
That's right. And I certainly think your conclusion makes a fair amount of intuitive sense, particularly if I don't understand you to be saying that blaspheming is also not a bad thing. I think blaspheming, desecrating the name of God is not something that he smiles upon. But I also think there's a lot of truth within what you're describing. And this can come into focus. I like the framework that you put together. When you think about something like a national social credit score, like what they've been doing in China, or with an ESG score, as is starting to exist in the corporate world,